The jagged silhouette of Tillamook Rock rises from the churning Pacific, a solitary spire battered by relentless waves and wind. For decades, men lived upon its terraces and within its narrow tower, enduring isolation few could imagine. Storms crashed with unyielding force. Fog swallowed the rock whole, and every shadow seemed to whisper secrets of those who came before. History records more than duty and vigilance. Keepers vanished, others succumbed to unexplained fear, and the structure itself became a crucible of the mind. On this journey across treacherous cliffs, salt-laden terraces, and the ghostly interior of the lighthouse, you will witness the harsh conditions faced by the men who tended its light. From first-hand logs to chilling accounts of storms and mysterious phenomena, the story of Tillamook Rock reveals not only survival against nature, but the gradual unravelling of those trapped by isolation and the ocean's unforgiving presence. The phantom sentinel of the Pacific. The roar of the Pacific was no mere backdrop along the rugged Oregon coast. It was the constant arbiter of fate for every vessel that crept northward from the Columbia River into open ocean. In the latter years of the 19th century, sailors spoke in terse logs and weathered seafarers' cant of a particular stretch of water where swirling fog banks, treacherous reefs, and invisible currents conspired to crush masts and hulls alike. The waves that broke against the jagged shoreline near Cape Falcon carried wreckage from ships that had misjudged their course in darkness, and maritime authorities, grounded in sobering reports from masters and mates, knew that without another guiding light these tragedies would multiply. Congress appropriated funds in 1878 for a new lighthouse along Oregon's storm-ridden shore to aid northbound mariners and to serve as a sentinel against the brute strength of sea and fog. Initial surveys considered the lofty summit of Tillamook Head, a promontory rising more than 1,000 feet above the crashing surf, but keepers on the headland would have found their beacons swallowed in the rolling grey shroud that settled there for weeks at a time. The decision then turned to a far more daunting sight, a basalt outcrop, scarcely an acre in area, thrust defiantly from an unforgiving stretch of water more than a mile offshore. Mariners already whispered an ominous moniker for the rock, Terrible Tilly, for it seemed to rise where the ocean's rage never slumbered, where seas pummeled its steep flanks with a violence unmatched elsewhere along that section of the Pacific. The rock had long been noted on mariner charts, not for safe anchorage but for peril. Local indigenous tribes revered the sea and spoke in hushed tones of reefs and winds, yet they too avoided this offshore sentinel whose surrounding waters were known for sudden gusts and hidden shoals. Merchant captains returning to port recounted nights when their compasses quavered near their shadow, and the cries of those lost at sea were attributed to the siren-like tumult of wind and wave around that lone stone. Here, the ocean offered no quarter, and this grim reputation formed the first whisper of mystery around the light that was to come. Assigning men to survey the rock proved perilous even before construction began. A master mason lost his footing during an early reconnaissance and was swallowed by the cold Pacific. His body was never recovered. The schooners tasked with ferrying crews approached with grim caution. A single misjudged swell could fling a boat against the rock's unforgiving surface. Experienced quarrymen from inland towns were reluctant to make the journey, and it took the persuasion of a foreman familiar with coastal bluffs to recruit a crew hardened by storms and accustomed to risk. Even so, each trip out to the rock was timed between the mercurial gusts and towering seas that defined this stretch of ocean. Once ashore, the labourers faced an environment that seemed designed to undermine every human effort. The surface of the rock was a labyrinth of jagged ridges and narrow ledges, barely wide enough to accommodate the crude shelters they erected against winds that often exceeded gale force. They blasted and levelled basalt, laying terraces with basic tools and brute determination, and erected derricks and cable systems to hoist stone and supplies from vessels that danced on the waves far below. Contemporary accounts speak of storms so fierce that entire supply houses were swept away and men were trapped for days amid howling wind and spray. Provisions spoiled, tools were lost to the sea, and every meal was wrested from a landscape that offered nothing. The engineering feat was extraordinary for its era. The lighthouse's foundation had to withstand the rhythmic battering of tides that refracted across the rock's truncated sides and the seasonal onslaught of winter gales. Crews worked with meticulous care to set massive stone blocks with minimal margin for error. guided by engineers who balanced precision with urgency, knowing that each delay invited another storm. The fog signal equipment and the first-order Fresnel lens, among the most advanced optical inventions of the age, were hauled up in stages, each component a triumph against nature's apparent hostility. These were not solitary men on a distant shore. They were participants in an unfolding human drama played out on a stage that seemed indifferent to their existence. On January 21, 1881, after nearly 3 years of hardship, the lantern room atop Tillamook Rock was lit for the first time. Its brilliant beam cut through the darkness and fog, casting reassurance to mariners who had hitherto navigated only by fear and instinct. The cost, nearly $125,000, was steep, yet officials hailed the beacon as a triumph of maritime safety. Newspapers of the day described terrible Tilly with a mixture of awe and foreboding, an isolated guardian that seemed to defy the sea it watched. But even in its inaugural glow, the lighthouse could not dispel the sense that this stone, battered day and night by ceaseless waters, held a deeper influence over those who set foot upon it, an influence that no ledger entry or nautical chart could ever fully explain. And for the keepers who would soon be assigned to this lowly tower, the phantom sentinel's presence was only just beginning to reveal the hidden cost of its vigil. And every night after, that light gazed out upon relentless darkness that showed no mercy for the men who tended it. Isolation beyond measure. Cold spray lashed the narrow terraces of Tillamook Rock as the newest keepers stepped from the small supply boat and onto basalt slick with mist, the great lighthouse behind them cutting a stark silhouette against the grey morning sky. For all its brilliance, the great beacon felt less like a protector here on the rock than a reminder of how distant the world beyond truly was. The wind screamed without cease, and behind that howl lay another sound that would shape every day here, the relentless crash of waves against stone that knew no quiet, no mercy, and no sleep. In these first hours after arrival, the men set about learning their routines. 4 keepers at a time were assigned to Tillamook Rock, living and working within the cramped quarters attached to the tower. Rotations were long and unforgiving, at times stretching to 90 days on the rock, with only brief respites ashore. At dawn, one keeper climbed the narrow iron stairs to polish the great Fresnel lens, ensuring that its intricate glass prisms would refract light across a perilous stretch of ocean more than 18 miles wide. Another sounded the foghorn when the grey blanket settled in, a deep throbbing blast that cut across the sea's din and sent tremors through even the most seasoned keeper's bones. Outside, every surface was slick with salt and every breath tasted of brine, reminders that Tillamook Rock was not merely remote, but entirely separate from the world. Tasks that might have seemed routine elsewhere took on an oppressive weight here. Each keeper kept meticulous logs, shifts at the lens, foghorn cycles, weather observations, and maintenance checks on the structural ironwork. A sudden lurch of wind could bend a tool from its place, and storms often arrived without warning, demanding that even evening chores be abandoned in favour of urgent reinforcement of hatchways and shuttered portholes. In the earliest years of operation, keepers lived with only a telegraph cable beneath the surf to link them to the mainland, sending and receiving messages in code that was sometimes their only touch with the outside world for days at a stretch. Supplies were a constant source of tension. There was no dock and the sea had to be judged just right for a landing attempt. Too much swell, and the small boat would be dashed against the rock's sheer face. A breeches buoy, a pulley-driven device resembling a suspended cradle, was sometimes used to hoist crates of provisions and even the men themselves from the churning water below. Many a storm would sweep in just as a supply launch approached, forcing it to turn back and leaving keepers to ration what remained. Once, a powerful nor'easter during construction had obliterated a storehouse and left the crew stranded without fresh water or tools for more than 2 weeks before another vessel could fight its way close enough to deliver relief. These were not mere inconveniences. They were reminders that here, survival depended as much on weather and sea as on human will. Hours and days ran into one another on Tillamook Rock with uncanny regularity. The grey horizon offered no sunrise that felt new, no sunset that felt final. Fog and storm cloud erased distinctions of time. Keepers often spoke of how the foghorn's blast, meant to warn vessels, became a companion of sorts, its mournful groan endlessly echoing across decks and in dreams alike. And long before night descended, The Fresnel's beam had become as familiar to the keepers as the darkness it pierced, a circle of light at an island's edge that seemed to mock their own isolation. Within weeks, the psychology of the rock began to press in on each keeper in different ways. Some were stoic, burying themselves in tasks and the regimented duties of lighthouse life. Others became restless, unable to shake the feeling that the rock itself watched them. The fog had a way of billowing into corners, and the unending roar of water could be mistaken for voices if a keeper stood still long enough. Sleep was elusive at times, stolen in fitful fragments between the pounding of wind and the clatter of boards under duress. The mind, deprived of its usual anchors, conversation with neighbours, the sight of forested hills, the simple hum of distant civilization, began to wander into corners it might never have otherwise explored. When storms reached their fiercest, the very tower shook. Waves hundreds of feet high occasionally washed over the eastern face, and in one infamous tempest, winds exceeding 100 miles per hour drove boulders into the structure with such force that the original Fresnel lens was shattered and the windows splintered into fragments. On those nights, men lay awake listening to the tower groan, each impact sounding not just against stone, but against the fragile psychological defences they had erected against the relentless environment. Keeping the light shining was not merely a duty, it was a test of nerve, resilience, and the mind's own capacity to endure what felt like an unending siege. The companionship of fellow keepers was both a relief and a source of friction. In such tight quarters, disagreements that might have seemed insignificant on land could flare into deep rifts when compounded by exhaustion, stress, and the ever-present thunder of the sea. One keeper stationed on the rock reportedly succumbed to such strain, attacking a colleague's food with ground glass in a fit of rage before being relieved of his duties and sent ashore. Others simply chose not to return for a second rotation, preferring to forfeit their career prospects rather than endure another cycle of isolation. Yet for some, the rhythm of life on the rock became strangely habitual. Routines took on a meditative quality, and the chores of lighthouse duty offered a structure that helped keep despair at bay. The telegraph lines, when functional, offered moments of connection, and word of family and events on shore brought a flicker of normalcy. But still, the monitor of ocean and storm remained their constant co-tenant, indifferent, unconcerned, and impossibly vast. By the end of a rotation, many keepers reported a sense of dislocation upon returning to land. Trees seemed impossibly still, voices too loud, and the bustle of towns jarring. It was as if the rock had reshaped their perception, turning tranquility into something unfamiliar and almost unsettling. And though each keeper knew that rotation would eventually end, the weeks on Tillamook Rock forged a kind of psychological imprint that lingered long after they set foot back on solid ground. As the wind fell to a whisper and the rock lay cloaked in stillness, each man began to sense that the longest nights were not measured in hours, but in the quiet erosion of the mind itself. Storms that devour men. The horizon darkened with a restless grey, and the keepers felt a low hum in the air that promised chaos long before the first wave arrived. The quiet of the terraces, normally broken only by the crashing surf or distant gulls, seemed unnervingly still, as if the Pacific itself had paused to gather strength. Every man on the rock instinctively turned toward the horizon, watching for the first sign of the approaching tempest. A subtle metallic tang lingered in the air, a scent some keepers associated with impending storms, as if the ocean exhaled its fury before unleashing it. Sheets of cloud swirled in twisted columns, casting shadows that raced across the rock and hinted at the violence to come. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying a sharp salt tang and the sound of distant waves breaking with uncommon force. Each change in the sky was noted, every subtle movement of cloud or swell interpreted as a warning. The keepers had learned to read these signals carefully, for the ocean here spared no one who misjudged its temper. Occasionally the clouds seemed to twist into grotesque, impossible shapes, fleeting visions that made some men glance at one another in uneasy recognition of the uncanny. Hatches were bolted, lanterns checked, and every loose plank secured as the keepers moved with the precision of practiced urgency. They worked silently, understanding that noise could carry far and attract hazards from the storm, and that even a single misstep could be disastrous on the slick terraces. The routines they had rehearsed for months now felt the weight of inevitability, Every action was both preparation and defiance. Some keepers paused briefly at the edge of the terrace, feeling the subtle vibrations beneath their boots as if the rock itself quivered in anticipation. The ocean rose in white-tipped ridges, and the first waves smashed against terraces with a force that shook even seasoned bones. Spray flew into the air, drenching clothing, hair and faces, leaving the men tasting salt with every breath. The sound of each impact reverberated like thunder through the rock itself, a relentless percussion that drowned out thought and conversation. The first strike was a warning, the next a test, and each that followed demanded vigilance. In the gaps between waves, glimpses of submerged rock formations reminded them of the hidden dangers lurking just beneath the surface. Iron railings groaned under the pressure of wind and spray, and the lighthouse shuddered as if acknowledging the storm's challenge. The keepers watched with apprehension as the tower strained against its own weight and the battering from the Pacific. Every bolt, every seam, every stone became a potential point of failure, a reminder that the rock might resist the ocean for decades, but human endurance had no such certainty. The groans of the metal echoed through the tower like whispers, as though the lighthouse itself were communicating a warning to those who lived inside it. Through the lashing rain, a doomed vessel appeared, pitching and yawing toward jagged rocks, its sails shredded and helpless against the fury of the sea. The keepers strained their eyes to follow the ship's tortured path, helpless to intervene beyond signalling with flares or the foghorn. Waves lifted the hull as if it were a toy, then slammed it down with bone-jarring force. In that moment, the lighthouse was a silent witness to human fragility, a beacon of warning yet powerless to alter fate. One man muttered a half-whispered prayer for the crew, aware that prayers were the only intervention the tempest would allow. Tools, crates, and debris skittered across the terraces, and the keepers clung to rails and ropes, acutely aware that a single misstep could be fatal. One misjudged lunge, one slip on slick stone, and the ocean could claim them as easily as the ship they had just observed. Even the simplest chores became acts of courage. Every bolt hammered, every hatch secured, carried the weight of necessity and survival. The spray often stung the eyes, and in the peripheral, fleeting shapes of the waves sometimes looked eerily like human forms struggling beneath the surging waters. Within the cramped tower, the sound of the storm reverberated like a drum, each gust vibrating through walls and into the marrow of the men. Sleep was impossible. Every thud, crash, and howl of wind sharpened awareness and deepened the impression that the storm was alive, testing them, watching their every movement. The small quarters offered little relief, and the constant vibration made concentration a laborious task. In the silence between gusts, some reported hearing faint creaks that seemed to mimic human footsteps, though the rock was deserted. Waves towered above the rock, lightning sliced the sky, and the wind screamed through gaps in the structure, leaving the keepers in a dizzying blend of fear and awe. They had faced storms before, but never with this relentless intensity. Water seeped under doors, pounding rain flooded walkways, and the tower seemed to flex with the effort of resisting the sea's rage. Every moment demanded presence of mind, yet the sheer scale of the tempest threatened to overwhelm even the most experienced. Occasionally a wave broke far higher than expected, sending curtains of spray across the upper terraces, leaving even seasoned keepers speechless. As daylight struggled through grey curtains of rain, the men counted shattered shutters, twisted railings, and the scattered remnants of their supplies. Each observation was a stark record of the ocean's power, proof that the rock could not shield them from everything. Every smashed plank and dented iron post told a story of collision, resistance, and survival, and the keepers meticulously noted each for future repairs and reports. The scattered debris occasionally shifted under the wind, producing sudden, startling noises that reminded the men how alive the rock still felt in the storm's wake. The rain had eased, but the terraces remained slick and treacherous, and the keepers' muscles ached from the strain of enduring the storm's relentless assault. Fatigue pressed on their limbs, and the mind, already on edge, now struggled to relax even as the danger diminished. Simple movements were deliberate, cautious. The men were conscious that the storm's aftermath could be just as dangerous as its fury. Even now, some paused to glance at the horizon, half expecting the next wave to rise like a phantom from the depths. They sat in the quiet aftermath, staring at the churning ocean, and felt the full weight of how small and fragile their lives truly were against nature's might. Relief was temporary. The memory of the tempest lingered, etched in every twitch of a railing or creak of stone. The rock seemed to hold its own memory of the assault, a silent record of power that humans could neither conquer nor ignore. Some keepers found their eyes drawn to the dark shapes on the horizon, wondering if the ocean might be rehearsing for another act, unseen but inevitable. Looking out to sea, some recalled the logs of earlier keepers, whose words recorded shipwrecks and tempests that had left only fragments behind. Each historical account reinforced the lesson that Tillamook Rock was more than an outpost. It was a proving ground for human endurance against forces far beyond human control. The records offered both caution and context, situating the present storm within a continuum of peril and survival. They spoke of storms that lingered for days, leaving men questioning whether the rock itself might someday reclaim them. Repairs would take hours, and the rock bore the scars of the storm as visibly as it had imprinted lessons on the minds of the men who survived it. Tools, debris, and the twisted remains of minor structures demanded attention, yet every task carried the invisible weight of fatigue and dread. In the quiet moments between effort, the men reflected on what had passed, realizing that the sea had left its mark not only on stone and iron, but on their own perception of safety and mortality. Shadows from broken timbers and warped railings seemed to twist in the fading light, suggesting shapes that were not entirely of this world. A silent weight lingered over the keepers, a reminder that some storms carved marks deeper than stone or timber. Shadows and sounds. No one could explain. In the calm after the storm, the lighthouse seemed to hum with a quiet insistence, as though unseen eyes were observing every movement. The terraces glistened with residual rain, and the faint scent of salt and ozone lingered in the air. Each man felt an intangible pressure, a sensation that the rock itself had absorbed the storm's fury and now watched silently as if judging their endurance. Subtle vibrations travelled through the floors, almost imperceptible, yet enough to make the keepers glance around, certain of being observed even in the absence of another human soul. Shadows shifted along the stone walls in impossible angles, stretching and twisting in ways that no lantern or wave could produce. They seemed to slither at the periphery of vision, appearing and disappearing as if they had a life of their own. Lantern light flickered across wet surfaces, amplifying the distortion. The keepers often caught these movements in the corner of their eyes, only for them to vanish when examined directly, leaving a trace of unease that settled in the chest like a cold weight. A soft tapping echoed from the upper terraces, irregular yet deliberate, each sound unnerving in its persistence. The noise lacked an apparent source, coming sometimes from above, sometimes from below, as if it moved with intent across the rock. One keeper froze mid-step, ears straining, listening for a pattern, any rational explanation. But the tapping continued in a rhythm that defied the wind and water. It was subtle, almost polite, yet it carried the suggestion that the lighthouse was alive and communicating in a language they could not understand. Hands trembled over the tools and notes as men glanced toward corners where nothing should have been, wary of what their eyes might fabricate. Simple chores, sweeping terraces, checking lanterns, logging weather data, were now performed with hesitation. Every small sound, every shifting shadow felt amplified by the intense isolation. The keepers shared silent looks, each aware that their minds might be creating what was not there, yet none dared dismiss what their senses reported. Silence between gusts felt oppressive, each breath amplified, each creak magnified, until every ordinary noise seemed charged with intent. In these moments, the absence of the storm's roar was more terrifying than its presence. A dropped tool or a shifting shutter sounded as though it were approaching from every direction, bouncing against stone walls and wooden beams in a disorienting chorus. Even seasoned keepers found their pulse quickening, the tension nearly indistinguishable from fear itself. Reflections from the lantern glass scattered across wet stone, creating flickers that might have been illusions but were impossible to dismiss entirely. Light bent through droplets clinging to railings, and the uneven surfaces of terraces fractured each image into jagged fragments. The keepers noticed figures appearing and disappearing in these reflections, though no one was present to cast them. At times, the reflections seemed to move independently, mirroring neither the lantern nor the men, suggesting a subtle distortion between perception and reality. Earlier logs spoke of footsteps heard in empty corridors, doors opening without wind, and fleeting figures glimpsed at twilight, events repeated over decades. One entry described a keeper hearing a voice call his name from the fog, only to find the terraces empty. Another noted the soft sound of a bell from below, though the foghorn was silent. These historical references grounded the modern experiences in fact, showing that the phenomenon was neither imagined nor new. It was embedded in the lighthouse's long and strange history. The ocean's roar sometimes synchronized with the rhythmic knocks on the terrace, blurring the line between natural turbulence and something else entirely. Waves crashed in harmony with the tapping, creating a disturbing cadence that made the men question whether the lighthouse and sea were conspiring to unsettle them. The rhythm intensified during lulls, and the keepers could swear that subtle patterns emerged, pauses and repetitions that seemed too deliberate to be coincidental. Darkness brought a new clarity to the anomalies, shapes emerged where none should exist, and the wind's whisper became a language of warning. As night fell, shadows lengthened and distorted, taking on forms that resembled crouched figures, fleeting silhouettes, or impossibly thin spires of black. The keepers strained to trace the origin of these images, yet the more they focused, the more they evaded understanding, leaving the mind to oscillate between reason and dread. By the third night, exhaustion sharpened every sound and shadow, leaving the men unsure whether perception or imagination held sway. Fatigue transformed minor anomalies into threats, and every creak or whisper prompted an instinctive flinch. Sleep was fragmented, disturbed by dreams populated with impossible shadows, and wakefulness was heavy with the sense that unseen eyes followed each movement. Even the most pragmatic keepers began to wonder whether the lighthouse had a consciousness of its own. Even from the highest windows, the fog and churning sea seemed to cast forms that moved with intent, vanishing when examined closely. Waves created illusions of approaching figures, while the interplay of fog and lantern light made railings appear like slanting spires or spectral hands. Keepers often found themselves staring for long minutes, heart hammering, before realizing that the shapes were natural, yet somehow uncanny, as if the environment conspired to mimic life. Bodies ached from constant vigilance, eyes burned from sleeplessness, and minds strained against the unrelenting tension that made ordinary spaces seem hostile. Each task required deliberate focus, and every sound drew suspicion. Even familiar corners and stairwells felt unfamiliar and threatening. The combination of fatigue, isolation, and exposure to repeated, inexplicable events created a subtle psychological pressure, slowly eroding certainty and amplifying perception into suspicion. One log entry noted a lantern swinging of its own accord and a sound like distant footsteps pacing the terraces, though no one had moved outside. The keeper wrote of the moments when shadows seemed to gather in corners, the lantern lights flickering in response, and an overall sensation that the rock itself was aware of the men's presence. These notes lent a factual backbone to the uncertainty, showing that previous keepers had documented events that could not be dismissed as imagination. The keepers exchanged a few words, each aware that what they had seen and heard might never have a rational explanation, yet lingered in memory like a living shadow. They cleaned terraces, secured equipment, and moved through familiar spaces with caution, each gesture heavy with the knowledge that perception itself could deceive. The lighthouse, though a refuge and a beacon, also revealed its more inscrutable nature to those who spent extended time within its walls, leaving an enduring sense of unease. Some of the phenomena faded with daylight, but a sense of unseen presence remained, as if the lighthouse itself held secrets the men would never fully understand. The Keeper's Journal, Descent into Madness. The journals lay open on the damp desk, each page etched with the careful yet faltering hand of a man slowly surrendering to the rock's solitude. Ink smudged in places, water stains curling along the edges, told their own story of a place that challenged both body and mind. Even the neatest entries carried an undercurrent of unease, a quiet tremor beneath lines of routine observations. The keeper's meticulous notes of tides, wind, and equipment inspections now seemed interlaced with something more, a subtle record of mental strain accumulating day by day. At first, Entries spoke of minor irritations and restless nights, small disruptions noted with precise observation, yet tinged with unease. The wind's occasional groan or a lantern flicker was documented with calm detachment, though language hinted at vigilance sharpened by the rock's isolation. Observations of distant ships or the changing swell of waves were catalogued alongside fleeting feelings of dread, suggesting that even the most disciplined men could not fully separate fact from the mounting tension of being perched above a merciless ocean. Lanterns were checked multiple times each hour, doors locked and unlocked with meticulous care, and every tool counted and recounted in obsessive detail. Such repetition, initially framed as diligence, began to dominate daily routines, consuming hours that should have been spent on maintenance or rest. The journals recorded these behaviours in a matter-of-fact tone, but the pattern became clear. What began as a careful habit was morphing into a compulsive ritual, a psychological bulwark against the relentless uncertainty of the rock. References to fleeting shadows and whispered noises grew more frequent, each observation recorded with a mixture of apprehension and disbelief. Figures glimpsed at the edge of sight, sounds without identifiable sources, and fleeting motions in empty corridors were catalogued with precision, though the keepers could not explain their origin. The repetition of these entries across weeks suggested a mind increasingly attuned, or perhaps hypersensitive, to stimuli that the lighthouse and its environment offered in abundance: echoes, reflections, and the endless interplay of wind, water, and stone. The keepers began attributing intent to the wind and the waves, convinced that the ocean conspired to unsettle their minds and watch their every movement. A journal described the rhythmic pounding of waves as deliberate, almost conversational, and the groaning of beams as communicative. Patterns perceived in the natural environment were interpreted as signs or warnings, evidence that the rock itself possessed awareness. Observers documented these interpretations with a mix of scientific notation and tremulous commentary, illustrating the subtle erosion of rational perspective under extreme isolation. Sentences trailed off mid-thought, words repeated or crossed out, and margins filled with frantic notations as coherence slowly eroded. In some cases, entire pages consisted of loops of the same phrases, reflecting both obsession and an inability to progress past intrusive thoughts. These fragmented entries betrayed a mind attempting to impose order on chaos but finding none, leaving the keeper's internal anxieties written plainly for anyone who later consulted the logs. Logs described sudden bursts of panic, obsessive cleaning of the terraces, and avoidance of corners where shadows might linger. One keeper noted checking the same railing 30 times in a single night, convinced it had been loosened by an unseen hand. Another recounted pacing through corridors, lantern clutched, whispering reassurances to himself. These behaviours, though documented matter-of-factly, conveyed an escalating psychological burden that left the keepers perpetually on edge, unable to distinguish between real danger and imagined threat. Arguments erupted over minor mistakes, and suspicion between keepers intensified, each man seeing the other as a potential source of unseen danger. Journals hinted at conversations interrupted by fear, accusations whispered in tense silence, and small errors blown into perceived betrayals. The isolation amplified tension, transforming everyday human interaction into a fragile dance of distrust, where even the slightest misstep could provoke suspicion or resentment, compounding the already mounting psychological pressure. Entries reference previous keepers who documented similar spirals, revealing a lineage of minds tested and sometimes broken by the rock's relentless environment. Notes from decades prior described sleepless nights, obsessive maintenance, and sudden fits of irrational fear striking men who had once appeared steady and disciplined. These historical parallels, carefully annotated in the logs, offered a sobering perspective. The environment of Tillamook Rock did not merely challenge the body, it consistently tested the limits of the human mind. Figures were reported moving in empty corridors, and lantern light appeared to flicker in response to imagined threats, blurring the line between perception and reality. Some entries detailed shadows that seemed to follow a keeper as he moved, only to vanish when observed directly. Others described the sound of footsteps pacing above or below, synchronized with no discernible pattern, creating a sense of presence in entirely vacant spaces. While later analysis might attribute some occurrences to optical illusions or acoustical effects, the journals capture the immediacy and terror experienced by men entirely alone with their senses. Sleep vanished entirely for some, and rituals became compulsive, with entire days spent securing doors, windows, and instruments against threats that may not have existed. Journals describe men rising repeatedly to check lanterns, pacing terraces in rhythmic loops, and recording minor disturbances as if documenting the approach of a real enemy. This obsessive repetition intensified fatigue, and the rock's isolation magnified the weight of every shadow and sound, creating a feedback loop in which paranoia fueled behaviour that further disrupted rest and stability. The confined quarters, the constant ocean roar, and the shadows creeping along walls created a suffocating pressure that invaded both body and mind. Journal entries often referenced the oppressive combination of sensory overload and solitude, the howl of wind in the structure's cracks, the spray battering terraces, and the persistent sensation that someone or something was present. These observations, though expressed with the tone of careful record-keeping, convey a mounting terror compounded by proximity, enclosure, and unrelenting sensory stimulation. Dates, times, and meticulously logged observations served as a grim record, grounding their unravelling in verifiable fact while hinting at the inexorable toll on sanity. The keepers recorded events with precision: when doors were checked, when lanterns were lit, when shadows were perceived. Though methodical, these notes reveal a mind gradually consumed by the environment, where logic contended with dread and the boundary between observation and obsession dissolved. Each journal ended with unfinished thoughts, the handwriting growing shakier, leaving an unmistakable sense of desperation frozen in ink. Pages that began with straightforward entries of daily duties devolved into disjointed reflections, questions left unanswered, and sudden exclamations that hinted at fear too immediate to articulate fully. The records, read together, trace a slow descent, revealing the psychological cost exacted by isolation, exposure, and relentless sensory challenge. Even after the last page was closed, the lingering traces of fear and obsession clung to the lighthouse, a silent testament to minds tested beyond endurance. Disappearances and unaccountable deaths. After the final entries were made, a series of incidents began to unfold that no record could fully explain, as if the lighthouse itself demanded attention. Men who had weathered storms and isolation with stoic precision suddenly found themselves at the centre of circumstances that seemed to defy reason. Logs and letters recorded events with careful language, yet the undertone was unmistakable. Tillamook Rock had a history that refused to be fully understood, and those who served upon it could vanish or die under conditions that offered no clear explanation. Even routine relief visits could be marked by absence or delay, leaving the rock in uneasy quiet for days at a time. One keeper vanished during a routine check of the terraces, leaving behind only a lantern still lit and the faint echo of his final steps. The remaining men scoured the terraces and the surrounding rocks at low tide, calling out into the wind, but no answer came. Later reports would note that no equipment had been displaced, and no signs of struggle had been observed. Even when search boats combed the surrounding waters, nothing was found. The disappearance was catalogued meticulously, a void marked by silence, leaving an impression that the rock itself had claimed him without effort. Relief crews arriving days later noted the lingering tension, remarking on the palpable unease in the remaining men. A subsequent entry described a man found lifeless at the base of a stairwell, the cause officially attributed to an accident, but the circumstances that defied ordinary reasoning. Witnesses noted that the stairs had been swept, dry, and free from obstruction, yet the man's fall appeared sudden and inexplicable. The official report emphasized natural causes, yet the careful notation of minor oddities, the slight tilt of a railing, the faint smear of salt water near the landing, hinted that not everything about his death could be comfortably explained. Later entries recorded how the discovery cast a long shadow over the tower, and that no one who had witnessed the scene could shake the sense that something beyond ordinary hazard had intervened. As the years passed, records revealed an unsettling repetition. Men would disappear or die under conditions that offered no clear explanation. Some were lost while performing routine maintenance, and others vanished during periods of calm weather when the rock should have been safe. One log recounted a keeper who went to inspect a foghorn and never returned, His shoes were found neatly placed at the base of the steps, as though he had stepped into another world. The logs did not sensationalize these events. They simply documented them with exacting detail, yet the pattern that emerged created a quiet but pervasive sense of dread for anyone reviewing the history of the lighthouse. Coast Guard logs and lighthouse reports noted absences, delayed arrivals, and mysterious deaths, each carefully documented yet never fully clarified. Communication with the mainland occasionally confirmed missing men who had not arrived for scheduled relief. Their last movements traced with precision, but ultimately ending in unanswered questions. Investigations turned up no definitive cause. The rock remained an unyielding witness, keeping its secrets intact while those who served on it faced the reality of extreme vulnerability. Some reports even described fog or mist forming unexpectedly around the terraces during disappearances, a phenomenon briefly noted but never explained. The remaining men grew watchful, eyes constantly scanning terraces and windows, haunted by what had been lost and fearing what might come next. Every shadow, every creak, every wave breaking against the base of the lighthouse took on heightened significance. Routine maintenance became a tense ritual, each task performed with meticulous care and constant vigilance, as if the ghosts of those who had vanished might return to claim the living. Small sounds, an overturned bucket, the snap of a rope, were enough to set hearts racing, and men spoke quietly of imagined movement just beyond the edge of their vision. Several incidents occurred in calm weather, with nothing to suggest a hazard, yet the outcomes were as sudden and devastating as any storm could produce. A man inspecting a lantern might be found hours later missing entirely, his disappearance leaving behind only a note of routine observations, as though nothing had interrupted his work. Others fell from terraces or slipped on wet stones when no storm had passed, events recorded clinically in the logs, but experienced by the survivors as disquieting and almost impossible. One entry detailed how a keeper had vanished while painting railings in bright sunlight, with no sign of misstep, only the open air and the endless sound of the Pacific around him. Looking back, historians traced these events alongside earlier decades of service, discovering that Tillamook Rock had long been a place where misfortune seemed to accumulate. They noted recurring patterns in deaths and disappearances, repeated over years by different men and under different conditions, with little to suggest a common cause other than the rock itself. Archival material and newspaper reports corroborated some of these cases, giving substance to the notion that this lighthouse existed not only as a sentinel, but as a site of unaccountable peril. Some researchers noted the psychological strain documented in logs, suggesting that the combination of isolation, constant exposure to the elements, and the lighthouse's reputation may have magnified fear into tangible consequences. Stories of vanished keepers and mysterious deaths began circulating beyond official logs, feeding a reputation that blurred fact and legend in equal measure. Accounts of missing men, unexplained falls, and sudden fatalities became the foundation for local folklore. Mariners passing the rock shared whispered tales of spectral figures and foreboding lights, reinforcing the sense that the lighthouse's history was inseparable from the human cost of its operation. Even supply ships approaching the rock sometimes reported a quiet eeriness that could not be explained by wind or waves alone. Each successive incident weighed on those who remained, infusing daily routines with a tense vigilance that blurred the line between precaution and fear. Keepers spoke in hushed tones of the disappearances, measured every footstep and hesitated to venture onto terraces alone. The rock's relentless isolation magnified the psychological impact of each new event, and the lighthouse became not merely a structure to maintain, but a constant reminder of mortality and uncertainty. The pattern of loss suggested to some that the rock itself was a test, an eternal proving ground for human endurance and resolve. Even with careful documentation, the lighthouse retained an aura of uncertainty, a place where human presence was both necessary and perilous. Every absence, every unaccountable death seemed to deepen the shadow that hung over the rock, shaping the perceptions of those who followed and adding weight to the legend that surrounded Tillamook. The cumulative effect of these incidents was impossible to ignore, and the legacy of danger continued to loom over each new assignment, whispered among new keepers before they ever set foot on the terraces. The memory of those who disappeared lingered in the wind and waves, a silent warning etched into the rock itself for anyone who remained. Isolation and oceanic madness. the science behind it. The shadows of vanished keepers lingered in memory, but the explanation for their unravelling lay not only in legend, it could be traced to the subtle erosion of the mind under relentless isolation. Tillamook Rock, jagged and unyielding, imposed conditions that few humans had ever endured. While storms and waves were obvious dangers, the prolonged absence of human contact, combined with the unending visual and auditory monotony of the Pacific, created pressures on the mind that could slowly, almost imperceptibly, unravel even the most disciplined individuals. Even in fair weather, the horizon remained an endless expanse, offering no variation beyond shifting tides and drifting fog, a void that could warp perception over time. Cut off from land for days or weeks at a time, the men lived in a world defined by stone, surf and wind, where even a glimpse of another human was rare and fleeting. Relief vessels arrived on irregular schedules, often delayed by storms or fog, leaving keepers in prolonged solitude. Each day blended into the next, the cycles of light and dark fractured by the weather, so that temporal markers became uncertain. Letters and logs described the oppressive awareness of isolation, and how the knowledge of being physically alone on a rock exposed to the vast Pacific could weigh as heavily on the mind as the elements themselves. In some accounts, keepers noted that even familiar objects, tools, railings or lamps could suddenly appear alien, triggering anxiety in ways that were subtle but cumulative. The unchanging horizon, the repetitive sound of crashing waves, and the monotonous grey of the Pacific sky created a sensory landscape that dulled perception while heightening every minor anomaly. Small sounds, creaking beams, the skitter of water across terraces, the whistle of wind through cracks, took on disproportionate significance. Over time, keepers noted in their logs how shadows seemed to move at the periphery of vision, and how ordinary objects occasionally appeared distorted, a product not only of fear but of prolonged sensory deprivation. Even well-lit spaces could feel oppressive when the same stimuli are repeated endlessly, leaving little to ground perception. Researchers studying isolation note that in such environments, the brain can generate phantom noises and fleeting visual illusions, an observation that aligns disturbingly well with the keeper's own reports. Every gust of wind, every unexpected swell, and every slick terrace became a constant reminder of danger, imprinting physical stress on bodies already taxed by confinement and vigilance. The keeper's tasks required precision and constant awareness. One slip on stone or a misjudged step could mean serious injury or death. Fatigue, coupled with environmental pressure, produced an unrelenting tension in the mind and body. Heart rates quickened at the sound of distant waves, muscles remained tense, ready to react. Over weeks or months, this state of heightened alertness compounded, contributing to irritability, insomnia, and a sense of being perpetually on the brink of catastrophe. Chronic stress hormones, including elevated cortisol levels documented in isolated workers, can physically alter sleep cycles and cognitive function, creating a feedback loop that amplifies every perceived threat. Logs and letters recorded growing paranoia, obsessive routines, and occasional hallucinations, each carefully phrased, yet hinting at the creeping mental strain imposed by the rock's isolation. One keeper wrote of repeatedly checking a railing he had already secured, convinced it might fail despite all evidence to the contrary. Another described fleeting glimpses of figures in the mist outside the windows, shapes that dissolved upon closer inspection, yet left him unsettled for hours. These records, clinical in tone, offer a window into the slow erosion of rational perception under extreme isolation and environmental stress. They also reveal a pattern. What seemed like ordinary anxiety could evolve into obsessive monitoring or irrational fear, behaviours now recognised by psychologists as early markers of stress-induced cognitive distortion. Research from polar stations, submarines, and solitary confinement demonstrates that prolonged sensory deprivation can induce cognitive distortions, disorientation, and unpredictable behaviour. Studies have shown that humans subjected to minimal environmental stimulation experience impaired memory, distorted time perception, and hallucinations, phenomena that closely mirror the behaviours recorded in the Lighthouse logs. Chronic stress amplifies these effects, and the keepers at Tillamook Rock were exposed simultaneously to both isolation and extreme environmental hazards, a combination rarely studied but especially potent in shaping human experience. Observations from other isolated posts, including Alaskan and North Atlantic lighthouses, suggest that even minor environmental monotony can exacerbate fear responses when compounded by isolation, a pattern that seems echoed repeatedly in Tillamook's history. Even when science offers insight into the physiological and psychological consequences of isolation, the extreme and sometimes inexplicable outcomes at Tillamook Rock remain beyond complete understanding. Some disappearances and sudden deaths cannot be accounted for by environmental or cognitive factors alone. The cumulative weight of waves, wind, solitude, and prior tragedies may have contributed to mental collapse in some cases, but the precise mechanisms remain elusive, leaving a space for enduring mystery alongside rational explanation. Reports describe men experiencing vivid dreams or hallucinations while awake, in which ordinary objects appeared threatening or hostile, suggesting that the isolation could bend reality in ways that science can describe but not fully explain. Repeated storms, relentless waves, and the constant threat of injury compounded over time, amplifying fear and suspicion in men whose only companions were stone walls and the endless ocean. One observer noted in a report that keepers began to see patterns in the water or hear voices carried on the wind, suggesting that the brain, starved of novelty and security, sought meaning in randomness. Over months, these amplified signals could dominate perception, reinforcing a sense of unseen presence or inevitable peril, and in turn shaping behaviour in ways both subtle and alarming. Some letters even describe attempts to communicate with the ocean, as if the mind sought to negotiate with an unfeeling and immense adversary. The human mind, pushed to its boundaries by solitude and environmental extremes, can reveal both resilience and fragility, leaving traces in logs, letters, and behaviours that endure long after individuals have left the rock. The careful documentation of routines, mental state, and anomalous observations by keepers themselves allows modern analysis. But even these records cannot capture the full subjective experience of isolation, nor the way the rock seemed to exact a psychological toll that extended beyond the measurable. The combination of physical danger, environmental monotony, and social deprivation created a crucible in which even disciplined individuals could be driven toward behaviours or mental states that bordered on the irrational. Science could illuminate the shadows, but the true nature of the madness at Tillamook Rock remained as deep and inscrutable as the ocean that surrounded it. The Lighthouse. Today, an empty monument to madness. A brittle wind rattled the rusted railings as the lighthouse stood against the Pacific, its walls streaked with decades of salt and storm, a testament to the relentless elements it had endured. Even in calm weather, the terraces seemed alive with the memory of past turmoil, each wave against the base a whisper of the keeper's long-forgotten struggles. The rock itself, jagged and unyielding, appeared almost impervious, yet every surface bore the marks of time and tide. Once a hub of ceaseless activity and human vigilance, Tillamook Rock had been officially abandoned, leaving only the automated light to pierce the fog. The Coast Guard, having recognised the impossibility of safely staffing the outpost, converted the lighthouse to remote operation in the 1950s. Machinery replaced men, but the human echoes remained, embedded in every step of the terraces, every stairway worn smooth by decades of careful navigation. The absence of voices or movement magnified the scale of the rock's isolation, making the structure feel more like a tomb than a beacon. Visitors who dared approach the terraces spoke of an unsettling stillness, a weight in the air that seemed to acknowledge every footstep. Mariners recount that fog clings differently here, thicker, almost deliberate, and that the echoes of their own movements sometimes return distorted, as if the lighthouse itself were listening. Even experienced historians describe an inexplicable vertigo on the upper terraces, a fleeting sense that the edge of the rock could shift underfoot though each stone remains immovable. Remnants of past lives cling stubbornly to the structure, twisted metal, weathered stairs, and the faint traces of past routines etched into stone and iron. Rusted lanterns remain in their sockets, and old shackles and iron brackets bear the scars of years of wind-driven abrasion. Archives hold photographs and logs showing men perched precariously, repairing railings or tending lamps, and the contrast with the present emptiness creates a palpable tension. The space seems designed for human habitation, yet no one can safely endure it today. The surrounding environment exerts its own relentless influence. Fog and spray arrive without warning, tides rise with quiet inevitability, and the wind sweeps across terraces with a hollow, almost human wail. Birds nest in crevices, their calls echoing strangely in hollow corridors, while water seeps through cracks, leaving salt-stained streaks that trace invisible lines of time. At night, the lighthouse appears suspended between ocean and sky, illuminated only by the automated beam, which cuts through darkness like a solitary eye. Structural decay has claimed its due over decades. Metal railings bend under corrosion, stair treads crack, and the concrete foundation bears tiny fissures where salt water has penetrated. Visitors climbing the terraces tread lightly, conscious that each step carries both history and hazard. The once vibrant interior is now muted, paint peeled away, floors warped, yet in the hollow corridors one can almost hear the faint rhythm of a lighthouse once alive with the human vigilance. Even the automated mechanisms evoke a quiet unease. The light rotates without pause, a silent sentinel on autopilot, its hum and periodic flashes filling the emptiness where human presence once stood. Generators and wiring, though meticulously maintained, produce mechanical vibrations that echo like a heartbeat through rusted walls. Observers note that these persistent sounds sometimes mingle with natural elements, wind, wave, and gull calls, creating the impression that the lighthouse itself is alive in some imperceptible way. Researchers and historians who visit the rock often report a disorienting awareness of time. A single visit can feel like hours, yet in reality minutes may have passed, the rhythm of the ocean and wind creating a temporal distortion that mirrors the experiences of the original keepers. Photographers attempting to document the lighthouse note that lighting and fog conspire to produce illusions of movement, flickering shadows, and ghostly silhouettes, leaving them with the unnerving impression that the building retains the memory of its inhabitants. The lighthouse also holds a place in local culture and folklore, its name synonymous with perseverance, peril, and inexplicable tragedy. Newspaper articles from the early 20th century recount shipwrecks, vanishings, and the sometimes unhinged behaviour of men stationed there, while contemporary documentaries highlight its continuing allure. Even automated and unmanned, Tillamook Rock inspires fascination and caution alike, a symbol of both human ambition and the ocean's indifference. Physical traces remain inside and outside the lighthouse that connect directly to the past. Rusted rails bear the weight of repeated storms, terraces are marked with the erosion patterns of decades of salt spray, and small inscriptions carved by keepers or maintenance crews remain faintly visible. These remnants do not merely record history, they evoke it, creating a tangible link between the lives that endured the rock's isolation and the silent presence that dominates it today. Even in the absence of human activity, the rock retains a latent presence that permeates every corner. Shadows play differently on rusted walls, and the wind carries faint impressions of footsteps or distant voices. Researchers report an unshakable feeling that the lighthouse observes them as much as they observe it. The structure, though empty, communicates an unspoken narrative of endurance, isolation, and the cost of confronting the Pacific in its rawest form. Every element of the lighthouse, from its crumbling terraces to the automated lights slicing through fog, serves as a reminder that Tillamook Rock is more than a navigational aid. Its weathered metal, salt-worn concrete, and precarious stairways offer silent testimony to the keepers who once endured unimaginable isolation. Those who study it, pass it, or glimpse it from a distance are left with a lingering question. How much of the rock's history is written in stone, and how much is imprinted in the mind? Though abandoned, Tillamook Rock continues to hold its secrets, the weight of human endeavour and oceanic mystery etched into every weathered surface.